Welcome to the Stout Tales podcast. I'm your host, author Drayton Allen. Each week we tap into the timeless adventures of legendary beer aficionado Del Breowan as he searches the world for beer near perfection. Pull up a stool, fill up your mug, and let the fire crackle as we journey back to a simpler time when beer and ale weren't just drinks, but the closest thing to magic a humble serf could ever hope for. Del's journey to uncover the truth behind a legendary healing brew led him into the heart of a legal dispute. The Paladin Knights claimed their ancient recipe was stolen, and the brewer Killigan now faces the consequences. As old traditions clash with commercial ambition, Del must navigate suspicion, loyalty, and the lingering question of who really owns a miracle. And as always, the truth is in the brew. This is Stout, Episode 1, Part 2. Del, go ahead with your story.
Very well. I hope there will be no more interruptions. So, as I was saying before the interruption, the next morning I woke to a tumult of people in the streets. I had expected Freyhurst to be a quiet town of quiet folk, but something was amiss. I dressed quickly and woke Kip, and we went out to discover the reason for all the noise. Stopping a man who was hurriedly trying to roll a big barrel down the potholed street, I asked the cause of the commotion.
They've finally come to get Killigan and we're hiding our stores of Pallie Ale in case they come into town.
Who have come for him? I asked.
Don't be daft, the Paladin Knights, of course. They arrived early this morning and his workers are all fled to town to warn everyone. They said the Paladins are going to hang Killigan for stealing the recipe.
He began looking over his shoulder, anxious to get moving again. I did manage to get directions to the brewery from the panicked man before he resumed his frantic mission. Kip and I followed the road that led out of town to the north and toward Killigan's brewery. After several minutes of walking, we saw the brewery in the wooded valley below. It was a large building surrounded by barrels and stacks of firewood seasoning in the sun. Smoke drifted from one of the many stovepipe chimneys that dotted its roof. Its walls were made of rough-hewn stone, and the large roof was of cedar shake. As we walked down the long hill leading to the brewery, we saw 4 large chargers, which whinnied as we approached. There was no mistaking the identity of their owners. The horses were massive and wore the heavy armor of a paladin's mount. They hadn't been tied, but they obediently waited for their rider's return. Kip gave me a worried look as we walked closer to the building. I could now see the front door, or what was left of it, had recently been torn apart by a massive impact. Suddenly I heard a battle cry and the sound of thundering hooves beating the earth behind us. Spinning around in surprise, I saw a fully armed knight bearing down on both of us. The man and horse were huge, nearly 20 feet from hoof to plume. His silvery plate mail glinted off the morning sun, and huge clods of earth and soil spewed from the mount's massive hooves as it galloped. The narrow slit of his visor showed no face. Stunned in terror as the massive horse and rider rode toward me. I must admit I was terrified by the impressive sight.
Well met, goodly knight.
Kip tried to shout, but it came out more like a squeak. He waved his empty hands in the air, hoping he would see we were unarmed. I hoped that somehow we hadn't blundered and inadvertently breached some unknown precept of the Knight's Code. This was easy to do with paladins, since they had numerous rules and regulations, not all of which were evident or even related the normal rules that seemed to suit everyone else. The knight continued to bear down on us, and I found myself wondering if this was how my end would come about. Yet I could think of nothing to avoid my imminent fate. Outrunning the beast was out of the question. The vibration of the hooves on the ground shook me more than even my own nerves. I doubt I could even keep my balance if I tried to run. Thus, I could only stare in horror as the man's claymore that was leveled at neck height Kip regained his voice for another try, shouting much louder this time.
Well met, good knight.
The knight pulled his reins at the last possible moment, and somehow the huge warhorse was able to counter the momentum of the metal-clad mass before crushing the two of us. The knight lifted his sword above our heads. Instinctively, I still ducked the blade. We stood in shock as a cloud of dust poured over us. A voice resonated metallically from under the great helm.
Who goes there? State your business or be gone.
I managed to recover enough to respond. I am Breowan, a noteworthy brewer. Inspector, and this is my associate Kip Lambert. I am here on official business. I have come to inspect operations of this brewery and its claims of making its Paladin Pilsner beer, also known as Tale of Pallie Ale. We were told its story by a bard named Ankle's Knees at the Drunkety Dwarf Tavern, and have journeyed here to investigate the brewery's questionable claims. The knight lifted the visor of his helm and looked at us with a penetrating gaze. Looking at him somehow made my slight exaggeration about being an inspector burn in my mind as if I had just perjured myself. I decided that Kip and I should be cautious in our answering of his questions, lest he come to wonder what exactly a brewery inspector does and from where one derives such authority. Also, I quietly reminded Kip to think through everything before he opened his mouth. The lad has ever good intentions, but it would take some doing on my part to get us out of this mess. The paladin, still looking at us as if to pierce us with his gaze instead of his blade, finally nodded acquiescence. Then, in what I can only assume was his version of polite, he said,
I insist that you men join in a council trial being held by my order. Your expertise may be of use to us, in that we may derive the truth from the web of lies and deceit woven by this same Killigan.
I smiled back at the paladin. Thoughts of what might be the penalty for exaggerating to a knight began to cloud my thinking. I wished I hadn't been so quick with my story.
Would you and your friend be willing to testify?
The knight asked, rousing me from my introspection. If you mean recount the song the bard told us, surely we would. Or if you wish to make use of our expertise, then I shall avail you of that as well, I answered.
Very good. Follow me to the door, please.
Then he added,
Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Breowan, the generous hero of Sendigale. I am at your service.
He offered a bright smile and formal nod. I was surprised to see the man's gray hair and weathered face. He must have been near 70, but moved like a man in his 30s. Kip and I bowed slightly, returning the formality. I whispered to Kip, Best that I do most of the talking here, lad. We could be in for some trouble. Paladins live by the code. In the abundance of words can sin be found. Less said on our part, the better. We followed Breowan into the brewery. Picking our way through a smashed doorway, we walked into a large anteroom. From there, we proceeded down some steps to the main brewery floor. There were huge vats and casks filled with brews in their various stages of preparation. A number of large and small boilers were also positioned haphazardly throughout the large room, each one of them venting smoke up the stovepipes that passed through the roof above them. The strong odors of fermentation and roasted grains filled the room. It reminded me of home. This gave me a measure of comfort. Arranged in the center of the room were 4 kegs in a semicircle around a center keg. Upon each of the 4 kegs sat 4 paladin knights, and upon the 5th there was a red-faced man in a leather apron. I assumed this was Killigan. It appeared they had been questioning him for some time. No other brewery workers could be seen. No doubt they had all left as soon as the paladins arrived. I looked at Killigan, who stared straight ahead, his face set in an expression of anger mixed with insult. A discussion between the paladins stopped as Breowan approached the group. Owen began formally.
May I introduce Del Breowan, the brewery inspector, and his hail fellow, Kip Lambert. Allow me to present Cyprian Lord Felix, the hero of Elfal. He bears the eagle sigil emblazoned on shield and heart.
Fortunately for me, their shields were carefully leaning against each of the kegs upon which they sat. Thus I was able to put names with each of the men. The knight with the eagle insignia tilted his head politely.
Next we have goodly Sir Theodore, the zealous beacon of Mondeca, of the Griffin. Next, I present to you Sir Darius the enlightened paragon of Archizair, sigil of the dragon. Then lastly, our leader, his lordship Sir Raphael Xavier, the learned rock of Hathamir, of the boar sigil.
Then, as an afterthought, he motioned in the brewmaster's direction and said,
And of course, Killigan the brewer, our defendant.
Killigan gave us a questioning look. I bowed deeply. Such a distinguished assemblage! I am deeply honored. Kip also bowed, remaining quiet. I was grateful Kip was wise enough not to upset the knights. I had used the brewery inspector ploy before to get access to brewers who were a bit too secretive about their process. I would pretend to be an inspector, and Kip would pull out his parchments and begin sketching. This made us look official, and had gotten us into many places we had no business being. I generally did the talking, using my extensive knowledge of brewing techniques, asking questions and inspecting the quality of their gadgets and grains. Just because there was no such thing as a real brewery inspector was beside the point. Everyone always assumed there must be brewery inspectors, and now one was standing here in front of them. So we had never been asked for any credentials. I hoped that this occasion would not be any different. However, I sensed Kip was nervous. The paladins might not be as amused with fictitious inspectors as a brewer might be. A fellow beer fancier would most likely admire my gusto and smack me on the back, sharing the joke. Too late to change my story now, I decided, so better to push ahead without fear, as this might be detected by the wise knights. Sir Owen continued.
These inspectors heard tell of this brewery's outrageous claims of making a so-called Pallie Ale and came to inspect it.
The knight almost choked as he was forced to use the overly familiar term Pallie and Ale in the same moniker.
Therefore, I felt they might have testimony that may assist us in our quest for justice, Sir Raphael. They were present for a first-hand telling of the story by the bard, Ankle's Knees, and are willing to testify to it. Add to this their expertise in the field of brewing, and I believe they would make excellent candidates to be called as witnesses.
Very good, Sir Owen. I agree they are in a position to give us a valuable perspective. Have you explained to them the trial by four tradition of the Holy Order of Paladins yet?
Not yet, my lord,
Sir Owen said as he shook his head. The knight went on to relate to us the legal tradition of the trial by four that the paladins lived by. The explanation was a bit long-winded by normal standards, quoting this goodly saint and that holy book, but it boiled down to this. 4 knights decide whether someone was guilty, and if they were to hang him publicly or privately. As I listened to the knight explain, I nodded fiercely when such was expected of me, and even a few times when it wasn't. Kip, too, seemed to retain focus during the lecture as well. Since execution was mentioned frequently, he decided, as had I, that it was best to try to understand how not to have a trial by 4 be held for you. After the explanation was finished, I smiled and gave an indication that I was ready for them to proceed.
In reference to the claims of our new arrivals, allow me to ask you, Killigan, did you in fact tell your story to this bard, Ankle Steve, at the Drunkety Dwarf Inn, as asserted by these men?
Sir Raphael began.
Don't be daft. I've told my story to 100 bards,
Killigan said.
That is how you sell beer. It's advertising. You can't get people to buy beer unless there's a good story. No one will buy a drop if you say it's brewed in a big vat with pretty good grains and decent hops. You have to be creative.
To his credit, the knight tried to ignore the brewer's disrespectful tone and demeanor.
I'm certain I would not know how one goes about peddling beer, but in every tale there is a grain of truth. So let us hear this tale and pick our grains so we may decide the truth.
You're going to do it anyway,
Killigan said. He crossed his arms over his chest.
Very well, then. Let us speak with our good inspector,
Sir Raphael said. He turned to look at me.
Please recount the story told you by the bard. Ankles McGee, or whatever his name, please.
Sir Raphael said, growing irritated. The name is Ankles Knees, good sir, I said.
Yes, thank you. Proceed.
Sir Raphael said. He smiled, grateful for the help. I would be happy to, I said. But I want to state up front that I cannot be responsible for any embellishments the bard may have made to the story. The knight agreed, so I then proceeded to tell the story as best I could recount, with several interruptions by Kip as he filled in details or omissions. Killigan tried to inject a point or two, but each time the knight silenced him. When I had finished, Killigan's reddened face had darkened to a shade of purple as he seethed in frustration. The paladins seemed satisfied at the telling, and nodded. They looked convinced that the bard's tale was evidence backing their side of the story.
It appears from the tale told by the good inspector that Master Killigan did repay the good deed done to him with an act of villainy,
Darius the Enlightened said. The other knights shook their heads in agreement. Killigan stood up from his barrel so quickly it tipped over.
I know that's the story that I told Ankles Knees, but I didn't take nothing from those monks. I'm telling you the truth,
Killigan said.
I made that part up to make a good story. I guessed at the recipe.
Yet, try as he may, it looked that the matter was all but decided against him. It seemed all that was left was for the knights to decide the punishment. One of the knights mused aloud.
Public or private?
Kip whispered into my ear.
Looks as if Pale Ale goes from a chapter to a footnote in our book. It's a shame we couldn't have gotten some of the real Pallie Ale to taste.
That gave me an idea. Real Pallie Ale? That's it, I whispered to Kip. I boldly spoke up before the knights could proceed any further. Excuse me, gentlemen, I wish to make a point of order. They stopped talking and turned their full attention to me. It seemed my assumption was correct. A paladin would never allow a point of order not to be considered. After all, without order there was chaos, and of course chaos is from the Dark Ones. No paladin would ever want to be seen as being the slightest bit against order, and thus on the side of darkness. Seeing this advantage, I continued as loyally as I knew how. My friend and I, as mentioned, are beer and brewing experts. That is why we followed the tale of this beer here to this place. I paused for effect. However, I have a problem with how the bard portrayed this man's beer, especially when it came to the alleged recipe theft, and whether or not this brewer is adhering to the fine arts of the craft correctly, or if he has also violated the code of the brewers. This fictitious code of brewers statement had gotten the knights' attention. They always could appreciate additional violations to laws beyond their own, and they seemed eager to add new offenses for which penance or prosecution might be required. At this, Killigan jumped from his seat in a rage, trying to get at me in an effort to thrash me, for he perceived my statement as a grave insult. Being threatened by paladins for stealing was one thing, but to be accused of poor brewing standards by a fellow beerman, that was far more than he could bear. The knight nearest him grabbed him and forcibly returned him to his seat.
Really?
The lead knight said, drawing the word out to show his piqued interest. Then he added,
I would be interested in learning more about how this code of brewers might affect our understanding and thus aid our endeavor to render good and righteous judgment.
Killigan gave a loud, disgruntled,
Harumph?
Proceed.
the knight said to me. First, I would like to ask, have any of the paladins here actually tasted Killigan's brew to verify it is the same as your paladin beer?
Well, actually, no. No, we haven't.
Sir Raphael answered, May I suggest that I do an official test? I presume one of you good knights might have a sample of the original Paladin ale? My companion and I are, as mentioned, professional beer tasters. If there is any truth to be found, I propose a taste test to see if there is any similarity between the two brews. If they were the same brew, it would prove that he has stolen your recipe and is trying to profit from it. You see, as a brewer, our code is that we must rely on the senses God gave us to detect impurities. By using all of these, I hope to discern truth. Thus far, I have only used my ears. I must employ my taste, my sight, and my smell before I can judge the matter to its fullest extent. The paladins couldn't argue with my logic, but one objected,
The command is laid upon us that our holy brew is only given in case to save another's life. It's not for taste testing.
I had actually anticipated this objection. Yes, but if you find him guilty, it could mean his life, so a life does depend on our tasting your holy beer. I assure you, both Kip and I are men of unquestionable repute, and amongst the finest in our profession. I wondered if there were in fact any others in our profession, but decided not to put too fine a point on the fact.
One of the seated knights decided that he agreed with me and pulled a golden flask from his pouch. Handing it over to me, he said,
A small drink for each of you, but go sparing.
I carefully poured the liquid into a small testing glass that sat on a table nearby. Picking it up, I closely examined the color and hue of what I'd poured. I knew a good show would be important. Then I held the glass up to the light. Strangely, it shimmered of its own accord, casting out reflections from surfaces neither the liquid nor the glass possessed. I puzzled at this phenomenon for a moment, somewhat mesmerized. Therefore, I tried to focus instead on the liquid itself, ignoring the way the light seemed to play and dance upon it. The ale was as clear as crystal, with the slightest hue of amber, just barely perceptible when I held it to a white backdrop. I noticed, too, the odd way the carbonation formed on the walls of the glass, and how they rose to establish a head precisely one bubble in height. In addition to this, instead of random locations triggering the formation of the bubbles, they appeared in neat, evenly spaced rings along the sides of the glass, each of them looking to be the same exact size as all the rest. This began to unnerve me a bit, having never experienced such a bizarre characteristic in a beverage of any kind before, but remembering my audience, I pushed myself to the next step of the evaluation. I held the glass now to my nose and closed my eyes, inhaling deeply, smelling the contents. I could detect no alcohol. Its bouquet was unlike any I had ever encountered before. It was reminiscent of spring air, or the smell of freshly woven linen hanging in the breeze on a summer day, very refreshing. At last I lifted the glass to my lips and poured half of the brew into my mouth, counting to 20, as was my custom to allow the flavor to spend time on my taste buds before I swallowed. I handed the glass to Kip, who waited until I was finished before he tried it. Kip later said that, at that point, my face seemed to glow for a moment. I was enthralled at how the ale lightly caressed my palate, each taste sensor in my mouth ringing in perfect resonance to the flavor of the miraculous brew. I was stunned and speechless as the effect of the brew overloaded all of my finely attuned senses. The flavor was one of everything and nothing all at once. I searched my mind to find adjectives to express the experience and was at a loss for what seemed forever. Then I recovered enough for my literary talents to re-emerge. I settled on the term rapture epiphany to describe the flavor of the true Paladin ale. Neither word alone was sufficient. Both words together even seemed to subtract from the experience. But I had reached the limit of what mere words could describe. I was faced with the impossibility of describing the sublime. Kip now sampled the remainder of the liquid, and his face, too, depicted pure delight. Later he told me that pictures and methods of artistic technique imbued his thoughts, racing at a pace he had never experienced before. Techniques of depiction and ratios of perspective all swilled together in his mind as he approached the edge of understanding his art in its perfect form. Also, the toothache he had silently endured for the last several weeks was gone. He felt better than he had in years. In retrospect, I had noticed this effect as well. For weeks thereafter, the pain of my sore joints disappeared for the first time in my life. As the flavor of the real Pallie brew slowly faded, I then poured a sample of Killigan's beer. The Knights and Killigan watched us quietly. Again, I meticulously examined the color and clarity. It was much darker and had the normal bit of cloudiness for ale. The head was smaller than average, but not missing. I sipped a small amount, holding it in my mouth again before swallowing. Then I drank the remaining beer, followed with a healthy burp. Again, Kip aped me and did the same. Killigan's pale Pallie Ale was quite good, a bit different from other beers I had tasted before. Like the Paladin's brew, it was without the vapors of alcohol spirit that I am used to, but that was the extent of the similarity. It had a pleasant light flavor and a certain zing that made me feel more energized. Not like the miraculous impact of the Paladin's brew, but more of the zing of a nice cup of strong coffee, except tenfold. Without hesitation, I pronounced my findings to the waiting group. What can I say? The true Paladin brew was nothing short of miraculous, fantastic, and life-changing. While Killigan's alleged copy was a nice, refreshing drink of good ale that gave me a jolt of energy, it was in no way equal to the real Pallie Ale. It is by no means the same brew. In my opinion, there could never be an equal to it. The true Pallie Ale is miraculous. The knights began nodding and murmuring quietly to each other. With that established, now I would like to ask about Killigan's acquisition and use of this allegedly stolen recipe and its ingredients, if I may. I looked at the knights, who seemed satisfied with the thorough method I used. They nodded, seeming to agree, so I went on. Let me ask you, good knights, could you describe the steps needed, without revealing any secrets, of course, of making holy water? Lord Felix spoke up.
I have helped the monks with this task a time or two. I can only describe it in scant detail, however. It begins with a quest to gather the virgin snows of an unclimbed mountain. This is the first part of the process, of course, and this usually involves riding some kind of large flying creature, and you must...
He went on with several more seeming impossible tasks in the steps of its preparation, and then finally finished with,
The final step is the 14-day fast of 1,000 prayers, and then the adding of the tears of the saint. I believe that gives you at least serviceable holy water.
He then cleared his throat, looking around to see if any of the other knights had a helpful contribution to his explanation. How long is this entire process generally? I asked.
About 3 years for a quick batch. The Holy of Holies water takes a full 7. Any shorter than 3 and it goes off,
Lord Felix replied. Grinning, I continued. And the other ingredients? Manna, for instance?
Oh, that can only come from the loaf of St. Drury. It is added a single crumb to each vat by the monks.
Lord Felix responded. The sacred hops and barley?
Those are grown only on the holy grave sites of the monks of Andrew the Pitiful.
Lord Felix once again replied. I mused. Now let's find out how Killigan managed to get those ingredients for his beer. I turned to the brewer, who seemed to have stopped fuming and frowning. I hoped that he might actually be catching on to my ploy. Mr. Killigan, did you use any of those ingredients for your beer?
Well, mine is as good as theirs. Better, in fact. They are just being arrogant,
Killigan said, still a bit offended. Frowning at him, I said sternly, Please answer the question.
Well, you know I couldn't get any of those ingredients.
So, how did you get holy water? I asked.
Well, I took good, fresh spring water, and I boiled the devil out of it. Then I filtered it through 15 layers of fine linen cloth, 15. Then I added the rest of the ingredients,
Killigan answered. I turned to Sir Felix. Sir, does that make holy water in your opinion?
No, that's how we make water for tea,
the knight answered. Turning back to Killigan, I asked, So, Mr. Killigan, is it a fact that your beer has none of the same ingredients as the real Pallie Ale?
Well, no, not exactly the same, but it's still good beer.
That's not the point, is it? Is your beer exactly like the Paladin ale you drank at the Abbey or not? He paused, battling his inner stubbornness, and finally said,
No.
This recipe, did you steal it and the paper it was on? I asked.
I'm not daft. I left the paper there. I copied it down on my arm and left their paper where it was. It had no title on it. I didn't know it was secret. It was just a list of ingredients.
Getting an idea, I asked, What did you write with?
I don't know. I guess I used a charcoal pencil that was laying there.
So you used the monk's pencil to record the recipe?
Yeah, so what if I did?
Did you put the pencil back?
I don't remember. No, I took it with me. I needed it.
Well, there we have it, your confession, gentlemen. Your instincts were dead on, although you had missed the actual crime. Mr. Killigan is a thief, I said. By the standards and regulations brewers hold sacred, Killigan is not guilty of stealing the beer recipe, as you had first feared, but used it as an inspiration for a beer creation of his own making. He did, however, steal the charcoal pencil. He used to copy the recipe, and he has been using the name of the Paladin Order without permission. Then I turned to Kip and asked, What is the price of a charcoal writing stick in the market in town?
I usually buy a bag of 10 for a half copper,
Kip answered. Very well, then. Killigan owes 20 times restitution for the theft of the charcoal, which, according to my knowledge of petty theft common law standards, is the usual fine. Unless you sirs have another? I asked. The knights looked at each other, no doubt realizing the crime committed was indeed not as serious as they had first assumed. They were clearly not happy that Killigan had gotten a hold of the recipe in the first place, but they had to admit that he had not stolen it per se. Thus it could not be counted as the plundering of a holy icon, which was the capital crime he had been accused of. They understood, too, that by common cultural standards, the copying of the recipe would not be seen as any kind of sin or transgression. Recipes are passed among the common folk liberally. I had to admire the paladins, despite their terrifying appearance and tremendous prowess with weapons and killing. They were neither bloodthirsty nor intolerant of other views and cultures. I don't really believe they bought my argument about the charcoal theft, but they seemed grateful for my attempt at appeasing their sense of justice. They had settled down considerably once they'd come to realize the man was merely weak and not necessarily wicked. None of them was seeking a capital offense to satisfy some bloodlust. These men were far too devout for that type of thinking. I had figured out that they were mostly upset by the use of their order's name and reputation to be connected to a common beer. After a few moments of private consultation, the Knights' leader announced,
"Well, it seems you have solved our case for us, good Inspector. Obviously, your appearance here was divinely guided in order for us to bring this man to perfect justice."
We knew all along that some crime had been committed.
Sir Owen said. He then winked at me and finished.
"And the deterrent effect of this trial and the stories spread as a result of this day by the good people in this locality will help bolster our reputation and further our honor and commitment to justice. I believe I speak for all here assembled in saying the scales of justice are once again balanced. Now there only remains our coming to an agreement on the matter of the use of our name in selling this beer. That cannot be allowed to continue in the manner heretofore practiced."
After several more minutes of discussion, I finally managed to convince the Paladins to allow the name on the beer kegs to be changed to Inspiration in large print, then Tale of Pallie Ale in smaller letters. Kip was able to sketch a new label design that both the Paladins and Killigan agreed to.
Conservator's note. Here's how this beer rated in Dell's notebook. Inspiration, Tale of Pallie Ale. Look, 2.25. Smell, 3.5. Taste, 3.25. Feel, 3.5. Overall, 3.5. Appearance, pours a full white fluffy two-finger head but fizzes away quickly. It diminishes to a small single ring and leaves no lace on the sides of the vessel. The color is pale blonde with crystal transparency. Aroma, barley malts, rice, some slight roasted grain, a hint of mustiness, and a faint pinch of hop trailing behind. It's very pleasant to the nose. Flavor, decent but watery, has all the beer flavors, musty roasted malts, barley, rice, and yes, even a sting of hop. Feel. The feel tickles the mouth pleasurably, not with carbonation so much, although it's there, but with a stinging hop flavor and lightly burnt malts. It ends dry on the tongue, parching the palate. Overall, for a non-alcoholic beer, it has a nice feel and would give you a pleasant taste without the spirits. Also, it has a small kick that enlivens the heart and brightens your mind. No beer effect at all.
As part of this agreement, I convinced Killigan to distribute 3% of all of his profits on this beer to the Knights' charities. Thus he gave the Paladins 10 silver coins as a compensation for what he had sold up to that point. He began to object to this deal at first. Then I reminded him of the other options of Paladin justice. I whispered into his ear, publicly or privately. Suddenly the 10 silver coins seemed far less important with this renewed perspective. Of course, he added the copper for the charcoal he had stolen to be given to the monks. Then, in an unusual show of gratitude and good character, Killigan threw in an additional 10 coins for the monks. He explained it was for his room and board during his recovery. This made the Paladins very happy with their decision indeed. Perhaps they had won a greater battle here today than they had expected, one that went beyond justice and bolstered righteousness as well. When they left, the Paladins seemed satisfied things had been set right. However, they made no apologies for the smashed door. Yet Killigan wisely didn't bring it up. He was very glad to see them go. Grateful to me for my help, he further agreed to allow the inclusion of his newly named Inspiration beer to my guidebook, giving me a promise of 10 kegs of the brew for any research projects I might require it for in the future. I also told Killigan about the students at the clerical school, who would be very interested in his non-alcoholic ale with its invigorating effects. Killigan got quite excited at this prospect, picked up one of Kip's charcoal crayons, and carefully wrote down the name and location of the clerical school. I reached out, grabbed hold of Killigan's wrist, and said, Watch what you do with that charcoal. We'll have none of your thieving ways here, Killigan." The man was surprised and almost swung his fist until he saw the grin on my face. So instead, he slapped me on the back and said,
"How about a beer, my friend? I'd like your opinion on some of my experimental brews. You inspectors must get rather thirsty."
He winked. In the end, Kip and I had a fine new entry in my Gazette and a new friend. We left the next day. On the trip home, Kip seemed anxious to stop back at the Drinkity Drunken Dwarf Inn for some reason, so I decided to drop off a case of the new brew to Ankle's Knees the Bard. I spent the night updating him on how it had all turned out. Upon hearing the tale, Ankle got excited and set about composing a new ending to his Tale of Pallie Ale. Kip spent no little part of the evening courting a handsome young red-haired maid and seemed a happier man. The bard, Killigan, and even the knights had all become valuable friends. They introduced us to many stories of even more fantastic beers and ales, which we have featured over the years in our Gazette.
A drinkity draft, he draft,
The end.
he drunk.
And that, dear listeners, brings us to the bottom of our first episode of Stout Tales. We hope you enjoyed the stories of our friend Del Breowan, beer hunter, ale seeker, and relentless pursuer of the perfect pint. Thank you for joining us on this first tasting of our podcast. But don't rinse out your tankard just yet. In our next episode, Ale, the Terrible Tutors, Del gets recruited by the Paladins for a small favor and ends up babysitting a 12-year-old Henry VIII. Just wait until the foamy heads roll. If you enjoyed today's tale, subscribe, share, or scribble us a review on the napkin of your favorite brewery. This has been your host, Drayton Allen, and until next time, keep your whistle wet and your humor dry.
He drank a draft, a drinkity drink. He drank, he drank.